Hello everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to our live stream critique. If you guys can hear me okay, just type in the chat box and say hello. If you're having trouble with any kind of resolution, for those of you who are new to the live stream critique, this is streamed live. And so if you're having any issue with the resolution, try refreshing the page. Sometimes that helps to reset it. You will also notice an occasional delay between me answering your question and you asking it. So just keep that in mind that I am answering your question. It's just there's a slight delay because I'm trying to stream this as high quality for you guys to see as possible. So just keep that in mind. A few notes before we get started while we wait for a few people to trail in. All live critiques, these sessions are recorded, so if you can't make one of the sessions, it's no problem. I always post a link once it's available, the recording is available. I post it in our forum, so if for some reason you can't attend or you have to miss one of the live critiques, make sure you still send me your homework on Friday, and I will still review it, whether or not you're in the live chat or participating live. So that's really important because I don't want anyone to miss out on a critique. So today's session is going to be a little bit short just because we're only reviewing color charts. Next week it's going to be a little bit more intensive because we're going to be reviewing your first portrait paintings, and I'll have some suggestions for color correction and that sort of thing. My suggestions, because of the pace of this class, and it's pretty intensive, my suggestions will be emailed to you through like a JPEG file from the edits that you'll see in this program, and you can make corrections and then submit it to me to review the following week as well, in addition to your new homework, or you can post it in the forum and just ask if I had any further suggestions. So I know there's a lot to kind of keep up on. If you don't have time to make those corrections, don't worry about it. It's just I'm here to help you kind of improve your color, of course, and your overall confidence in your color for portraiture. All right, so it looks like everyone's here. I see some familiar faces. Hi, Brenda. Welcome everyone who's new. Thank you for joining the class. So how the live stream works is we're going to just kind of go through each person's piece and I'll give you a couple of suggestions for color mixtures. If you have questions while I'm working on critiquing your work, feel free to type it in the chat box and I'll try and answer it while I'm going through. If I'm not reviewing your work at the time, hang on to your question. If something pops into your head, just write it down, because at the end, when we're finished with everyone, we're going to do kind of an open Q&A session, so you guys can ask me about anything, even regarding the course or how it works, or if you have questions on last week's lecture. I don't know if any of you already started your new lessons, but there are quite a few to get through this week. So I just wanted to let everyone know that those are all released now. And there's about 5 videos, I believe. Some are short, some are quite long. The main demonstration is broken down into several parts just to make it easier for you guys to, watch a short session, a part of it, and then take a break. Also, the file sizes get really large. If I tried to keep it as one solid, I think it's about a 3-hour demonstration. So that's broken down into some shorter sections as well. And that's the upcoming, or this week's lesson, and your homework for next week's critique. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with Karina. Are you in here, Karina? Just say hello in the chat box if you are. And if you are wanting to participate and you can't participate in the chat box, it just means that you need to log in to your YouTube account or Google account, and then you should be able to type in the chat box. So if you're watching this and you can't, for some reason, type in the chat box, just make sure that you log in and then you can participate in the Q&A at the end. Okay, so this looks really good. I think, generally speaking, everyone did really, really well. So if you have any questions, it could be questions about your color preferences or the brands that you're using. This is something I talked about this morning with the morning critique group. Some people had a brand of like alizarin crimson or a different substitute that gave them different results from mine. And I just wanted to reiterate this for everyone. It's okay if your colors look slightly different from mine. That's going to happen naturally with brand to brand, different brands of oil paint. It will also happen if you're not using like a cad red light, but you're using a regular cadmium red, or if your alizarin crimson is like a true alizarin versus a substitute. And the reason I mentioned the substitute alizarin crimson is because genuine alizarin is a fugitive color, meaning it fades with time, and so it's not very light fast. And so if you use it in excess in your paintings that in areas that you used a lot of that alizarin are going to look more gray and fade with time, which is not something we want. We already invest a lot of time in our paintings. So one of the things I'm using in my demonstration is something called alizarin crimson permanent. It also goes by anthraquinone red. There's a pigment code on the back. Usually it's like PR 177 or 100, or it depends on what the pigment is. But you want to look for the one that is for anthraquinone red. And I believe I posted this in a conversation with a student earlier in our community forum. She was asking about alizarin substitutes. So, and later on today I am going to post in our forum a really great resource that's a website where you can look up pigment codes and it will tell you light fastness rating, and so you can see if you're using like a genuine version of that pigment, or you can find something that works similar that has a better light fastness rating. Okay, so it looks like you have a pretty good transitional step here. One thing I noticed with the last group was that the transition between alizarin and cad red sometimes was a little hard to detect because they're both intense reds. But I think yours is pretty good. So sometimes if this step looks too close to one or the other, these colors don't have much of a difference. But I can see a pretty distinct difference in yours. So I'm not too worried about that. It looks like your alizarin is maybe a little bit hotter of a color, a little bit warmer than what I was using. Mine has more of a blue cast, and that's because I'm using that anthraquinone red pigment, which is a slightly more blue red than even true alizarin. Were you using a true alizarin crimson? What brand, if you could note what brand you were using. I just want to bring that up so that everyone can kind of see what they're using, compared to other students. Yeah, it has to do with the brand probably, and whether or not you're using like a genuine alizarin or a substitute, and that's okay. I mean, if there's a slight difference, it doesn't matter so long as you're comfortable with the color. One of the things I mentioned earlier was that the reason I use a cad red light as opposed to a regular cadmium red, and I use the alizarin crimson permanent or the anthraquinone red, is because this one is much more blue and this one is much more yellow. So they're kind of pulling away from each other on the color wheel, and so you get a little bit more, even though they're both reds, you get more of a distinct difference between the two. So if you're not happy with your alizarin, you can always try getting one of the alternative colors like that anthraquinone red. I think Imgram makes one. I think it's called just anthraquinone red. And it goes very, very blue. It's not required. It's just a matter of you getting kind of accustomed to how your colors work. Same thing, there can be some variety with burnt sienna, but your burnt sienna looks pretty good. And your yellow ochre looks great. I know some people went ahead and made mixtures of the yellow ochre with cad red, and then they put it up above here. If you have room, you can also do that. And then they also took yellow ochre and alizarin, And they did a scale down here just so they could see some of the difference in how the color reacts with yellow ochre, because we don't actually mix the yellow ochre with these colors in this chart design in particular. But you might end up using something like that when you're painting flesh tones. So up here you might do one more row, and this is completely optional, but you can do cad red and yellow ochre. And then down here do the alizarin and yellow ochre. And so that could help to give you a better distinction of, you know, the difference between the two colors. Because you're right, when you mix these two together, it's a very subtle difference. And you'll see as we kind of move through other people's color charts that, you know, there's a lot of variety out there to choose from. And you might end up going with a different alizarin. Do you have any questions? I think your color chart looks good, your values look good, so I think this will give you enough of a range to work with for the class. If your alizarin is causing some frustration because it's too similar to the cadmium red, try grabbing, you know, that other pigment, and you'll end up with something that has a little bit more of that blue coloring to it, and it'll give you a little more variety. You'll get more of like a purple down in here rather than a red. So just let me know if you have any questions, but otherwise I don't really have any other suggestions. Yeah, so the exact one I used was, I'll write it over here on the side. It's Winsor and Newton Permanent Alizarin Crimson. But you don't have to go with this brand. That's, you know, just what I had on hand. But another one I also use is, it's by M. Graham. I think it's spelled like that. And it's called Anthraquinone Red. I know it's a mouthful. I will do a post in our forum and show and include a couple of links to this color in different brands so that it's the same pigment. And I'll also link that pigment code website. That's really a great resource if you're ever, you know, unsure of whether or not you're using, you know, the right pigment code. So I'll post that in the forum too, and you'll get an email notification when I do that. So keep an eye out for that a little bit later today. All right, really nice work, and I look forward to seeing your painting next week. All right, Erin. Oh, and if anyone has follow-up questions, so if you've made corrections to your color chart and you want me to take another look at it, you could either email it to me or post it in our community forum, and I will give you a response and give you any further feedback, or I can answer any other questions that might have popped in your head after the critique. Hi, Erin. I'm glad I found that and I was able to ask you. I think because you had sent it to me so long ago, and I had opened it, the email, I didn't look back that far. But that's okay. I'm glad I found it. This looks great. Very nice and clean. As a note for everyone else, you might consider, once your colors are dry, to add some notes of your color mixtures, at least what the main body mixture is here to here, just so that you can use it, because we're going to be using this as a guide. You'll see when we do the color mixing portion of this week's lesson that we use this color chart exactly to help us find the mixtures for our model. And this week we're painting a fair skin model, and she's very, very cool in her skin tones. So you're going to find a lot of colors in this range for her. So the guide is going to be really, really useful. And it can be confusing to remember what your mixtures are here. So having a little note off to the side is going to be really useful. Yeah, so if you're going to label writing on top of here, you want your colors to dry. And also, I forgot to mention, you might notice that your darks, especially the darks, but sometimes in the lights too, that the paint starts to look a little bit lighter in value or maybe more matte, and the colors aren't as rich. And that's just because dark colors tend to sink in. And so what I would suggest is once all of your colors are dry, apply a varnish to the colors. You can just apply it over the square, this square here, or you could just do a spray-on varnish over the whole thing. It can be Damar varnish, or it could be like something like Gamvar. That's what I used on mine, and it helps bring all those true colors back. And you want to do that before, if possible, do that before you start the color mixing for the first model that we paint, because it's going to give you a little bit more accurate representation of what these mixtures are going to create. So keep that in mind. And it might be easier for you to write on top after the varnish is applied. And I also, another student in the morning session, he just put on a little strips of tape like this in each section and wrote on the tape. So that's another option for you as well for labeling. So yeah, this looks great. I think your values look good. So here you can see quite a distinction between that alizarin and the cadmium red here. And it looks like you're using a cad red light, so that's why it's giving you that nice big distinction between the two colors. Are the permanent alizarin that you're using, is that the same brand I was using, the Winsor Newton? Oh, it's Williamsburg. Oh, that's a great brand. That's another excellent brand. The only thing I'm noticing is that these two are looking very similar, and it could just be the photograph that's kind of influencing that. But if in person that they're looking a little too similar in these two colors, you might consider pushing this row a little bit more towards cadmium red, just a little bit. So that way you have a little bit more of a distinction there. Otherwise, it looks really, really good. I'm not seeing any others that feel too similar. Like this transition is perfect from that burnt sienna to the cad red. You might also find it beneficial to, if you wanted to, you don't have to do it at the bottom. Some people did it off to the side and they just made a smaller scale, but you could try that alizarin with yellow ochre and then cad red with yellow ochre, because that combination is something we do use quite often in flesh tones, but you could see the distinction between the two when they're combined with a yellow. I did demonstrate, but I didn't actually paint it out so on the chart. But that can be a nice little extra exercise if you have time, but don't worry about doing it because there is quite a lot of work to do this week. Well, everything looks pretty good. Do you have any questions? All right, you're welcome. I'm happy to help. All right, so I'll just move right forward, but if you do have any other follow-up questions, just let me know. All right, so forgive me if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but Sapana? Did I say that right? or if you have another nickname you like to go by, and that goes for everyone. If you have a different name you'd like to go by, just let me know so I can make a note of that. I apologize. If you want to send me the correct pronunciation, just send me an email and I'll try and get it correct. People always say my name Brianna, and it's actually Brianna. So I understand what it's like to have your name mispronounced quite often. Okay, so excuse me. So this looks really good. I think the same thing's kind of happening in your color chart here. It's sinking in, and that's okay. This is just something that happens with oil paints. So I would, once your colors are dry, especially these whites, they take a while to dry. But once everything's really nice and dry to the touch, I would apply a varnish, and that's going to give you all of these colors that I know are nice and rich and beautiful. It'll kind of bring them back to life, and they'll look like did when you first created the color chart and all the colors were wet. So I would just suggest doing that. Your alizarin looks really good. Nice distinction between these two. And even though these get somewhat close, I can still see the difference in the color. This is definitely more blue than this. So I think you're in a pretty good range there. Burnt sienna looks good. The only thing I would say is, oh, so you're using a Cad Red medium. Yeah, it's a little bit of a darker red, and that depends on the brand too. Sometimes a Cad Red medium in one brand will have a lot more of a bluish cast to it than a Cad Red light, and that's okay. If it's something you're used to working with, then I would say just stick to it. The colors that I use are, selected because it's a palette I typically work around. Winsor Newton. Well, Cad Red Light is supposed to be very, very light. I mean, very bright and intense. The value is about a value 5, but it has a very intense chroma and color intensity. Now, part of that too, that kind of dullness that can happen, and whenever we're painting on like a middle value, if you paint really thin, you can kind of see it in here, like you see a little bit of the gray coming through. So you're actually, if you paint your color chart kind of thin in some areas or some passes, like it can happen in the dark transparents very easily, then that gray is going to kind of poke through the color a little bit, and it will kind of dull the intensity of that color. So just something to keep in mind, that is, if you paint a little bit thicker, you're going to get that full intensity of that color as it looked on your palette. I had a little bit of this issue too. It depended on the color, especially when you start getting into the transparent colors, then they start to do that a little bit. And cadmium red, even though it's an opaque, it could be that the color didn't have a high pigmentation. Certain brands, they put a lot of filler into their pigments. So the actual pigment ratio is a little bit less, and so you'll see through it, and it doesn't have as much impact as like a higher concentrated pigment brand. The brand Cadmium Red Light I'm using is RGH. RGH Artist Oil Paints. I'll write that down. If you just look them up on Google, you'll find them. He's an independent manufacturer, and so he does, everything's handmade, and so the pigments are made in small batches, and they are very, very concentrated. So I find that his cadmium red really goes a long way. I don't tend to use a lot of it because it's just so highly concentrated. Whereas Winsor Newton, I know for a fact they put in a lot of filler in their paint. So if you're not happy with how a color's behaving, or it's frustrating for you, I recommend trying, a different brand if you can get your hands on something like Williamsburg or the RGH, Natural Pigments. There's a couple of other brands I'd mentioned on the supply list that are all very good quality. And it doesn't mean Winsor Newton's all bad. I have a couple of colors in Winsor Newton too. It's just for some colors, it depends. Yeah, so I think your color chart looks great though. Do you have any questions? I don't have any suggestions other than what I've already said to a few others. If you wanted to, you could do another row, either up here or on the side of the cad red with yellow ochre, and then alizarin and yellow ochre, and just get a feel for how that color, those color combinations vary, because you're going to end up with something that's slightly more of like a peach tone if with the cad red and yellow ochre, and with the alizarin and ochre, because it's kind of a blue red, you get a more dull flesh tone, but it's really beautiful as well. All right, nice work, and I look forward to seeing your paintings next week. All right, Brenda. I saw you in here earlier. So this is looking really nice. I think your colors are pretty easy to distinguish. Even the value or the temperature difference between your alizarin and your mixture of cad red and alizarin looks pretty good. Some of these are a little washed out, but I think that's just the camera, so don't worry about that too much. You have a nice vibrant yellow ochre. What brand are you using? I think your burnt sienna mixtures look really nice here and here. Blue Ridge, oh yeah, they're an excellent company. I use a lot of their colors as well. So I think the yellow ochre I used also was RGH, but I've also used Blue Ridge, and he has excellent colors as well. Really highly pigmented colors. So that's another company you guys can try ordering from, is Blue Ridge. He's just a kind of a one-guy shop. He makes his own paints. He's really nice and very helpful if you ever have to call him, or if you've ever had any issues with a tube of paint. He's very, very on top of it, and he'll help you. And so, yeah, I highly recommend ordering from him as well. And the lead white that I often use is Blue Ridge, the Flemish white. Okay. Oh, and that's something I think I forgot to mention before. I mentioned it this morning, but for my color chart, I use titanium white because it just tints much faster and you don't have to use as much white. But when I do the painting, I do switch over to a Flemish white, or a lead-based white that's a little bit more transparent, and I like it just because it doesn't have a tendency to wash out your flesh tones too quickly. You guys might have noticed that as you were mixing up your color chart, that as you added white, it is very easy to like overshoot the mark with how much white. And also titanium white is a very cool blue white, and lead whites are kind of more of a yellow white, so they're a little bit warmer and lend themselves to luminous flesh tones a little bit better. But if you want to stay with titanium, that is perfectly fine. Just use whatever you're comfortable with, because the difference between the two is just slight, and it's very subtle. A lot of the reason I use a lead white too is because I like the textural consistency of a lead white, which has more of a long, what's called a long consistency, and it almost has like a tacky, sticky consistency that's slightly less buttery. I know the words are kind of hard to describe, but like titanium white's more buttery, and it doesn't, like, it leaves more stiff peaks, whereas the lead white will leave more long, kind of stretchy peaks in the paint when you play with it. So that's just something I personally like in my work. And it's just, a lot of it's just a textural thing. Yeah, so I think your colors look really good. I don't really have any suggestions other than if you want to, you could again do that optional yellow ochre and cad red, and then the yellow ochre and alizarin, just so that you have another reference. You could either add it down here if you have room, so do the alizarin and yellow ochre, or the cad red and yellow ochre up here, or you could do it on the sides. It's just so that you can have another color to reference as you're painting the the fair flesh tone model, especially because she has a lot of that pink kind of quality to her skin. To answer your question about the lead white that I prefer, I like to use, well, right now I've been using lead white number 2 from Natural Pigments. It's an excellent lead white. It does sometimes, because he does not use stabilizers and fillers in his paint, sometimes the oil separates a little bit more from the pigment. And so I've had a few tubes of it go kind of hard in a spot, but if you cut it open and just add oil, it kind of reconstitutes that paint and gets it kind of moving again. So it can be a little stiff. I'm going to probably try his lead white number 1, which is a little less, has a different consistency. He also has a Flemish white. So I often bounce between Natural Pigments and Blue Ridge, both for their Flemish white or their lead whites. Now with Blue Ridge, that Flemish white does have a titanium mixed in. So it's kind of half lead, half titanium, which is nice if you're doing more Prima, because it gives you a slight amount more of opacity, whereas a true lead white tends to be a little bit more transparent. Yeah. So your lead white, did it dry up in the tube? So what can happen now if you just got it like very recently, you can contact, and you bought it from Natural Pigments, you can contact him directly, and he will replace your lead white. He's really, really good about that. You might have to tell him the batch number on the tube, because he did have an issue with one batch that had gone out. So, but one thing you might consider trying is cutting the end of the tube off, and kind of wear gloves when you do this, but open up the tube, scrape out the paint, and then add more linseed oil, just regular linseed oil. You could use walnut oil too, but so if you actually, I think his might be made with walnut oil. I'd have to double check, but just add more oil and then you can mix it in, and it should kind of loosen it up again, and then you'll have to retube it. So that you can buy empty paint tubes anywhere online. And so that's what I did to mine, and I was able to save the tube of paint. But I would also encourage you just to contact him and explain to him when you bought it, the batch number on the tube, and he'll probably send you a replacement right away. Yeah, it's the only tube I've had a little bit of an issue. If you're struggling with that, then and it could be like a climate thing too. Try the Blue Ridge Flemish White. That would be my second suggestion, because I've never had an issue with that particular one having that separation. And it could be because there is some titanium white in there, and titanium dries much slower than lead white. So you might try, once you're done with this tube, try ordering the Flemish white from Blue Ridge and see if you like it better. Hi, Susan. Glad you could join us. Okay, so those are my only suggestions, Brenda. Do you have any questions? Sorry, I went on a little bit of a tangent there with the lead whites. Brenda, if you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. And I'll keep an eye on the chat here. Who did I just grab? Okay, Kaylee. Am I saying your name right? Yeah, next week is going to be more intensive because we're going to actually have some portraits to look at. So the suggestions are going to be a little bit more involved. But because we're just working on our color charts this week, our critique is going to be a little bit shorter than normal and not as in depth. All right, Kaylee, good. I'm glad I said that right. Just a note for next week, when you send me your file, I think your email might have compressed it a little bit, so it's a little pixelated. It's fine for the color chart. Don't worry about that. But just next time when you send your portrait for next week, make sure if it prompts you to scale the size, send me the full resolution. If your email is still compressing it, try using a thing like Dropbox or something like that and send me a Dropbox link to share the image. Everyone can do that if that's a little bit easier than uploading it to the email. Sometimes your email will automatically compress the picture. But the higher resolution picture I have, the better I can critique your work. Yeah, no, it's okay. Sometimes it happens automatically, so don't worry about it. All right, so based on this, your color looks really good. The two here, again, at the bottom with the alizarin, maybe a little similar. I can't tell if that's just the photo, but I would probably push this row here a little bit more towards the cadmium. It should look like it's almost a step between this and this. And right now it kind of favors that alizarin a little bit too much. So I would actually correct that if you have time. So I would just take, start with your base color here and just push it a little bit closer to that cadmium and then mix your lights and then mix your darks. And you'd have to wait for this to dry, but I think it'll give you a little more variety to choose from. So the alizarin is also way warmer. Is it in your picture it's warmer, or it's warmer in real life? I just want to clarify. Because there is always an issue with photographing, of course, and getting the colors to, oh, it's warmer in real life. Okay. One thing that might help is just thinking of this too as like a value step. So maybe this is a lighter value, this is obviously a darker value, so finding something that falls somewhere in between can also help you judge it a little bit easier. And some alizarin crimsons, I mentioned this earlier, are warmer, some are cooler, and so if you want to experiment with something like the anthraquinone red or even a quinacridone red, those are very similar colors, but they're a little bit more bluish. You can always experiment with one too and see if you like it better than the alizarin that you used. It might be a little bit more distinct in color as far as warmth. Because I know the one I used was very, very blue, so it gave me a little bit wider range. Yeah, your saturation in your colors, or the chroma in your colors, looks excellent, but you still have a nice value range, and that's what you want. I don't really have any suggestions. If you want to experiment with the additional two... Okay, so you bought the anthraquinone. What might be interesting is to leave this one, the alizarin, but beneath it, do a small scale of the anthraquinone red, and just make a note for yourself over here so that you could see the difference between the alizarin and the anthraquinone red. And that might be kind of a useful extra choice while you're mixing flesh tones, because our model coming up, she has very cool flesh tones, and she's very pink, but it's also like a cool pink. She doesn't quite have as much of this. She's more in this range. So it might be helpful to you to just see how that behaves slightly different. I think I mentioned this in the lecture on the chart, but whenever I'm adding a new color to my palette, one of the first tests I do is this tint and shade test. So I will make it a shade, and I will also add white to tint it to light, so I can see how the color behaves when you add white. Because sometimes a color might look really hot or warm out of the tube, and as soon as you introduce white, it might go in a completely unexpected direction. Indian red has a tendency to do that. It goes very purple, and it's kind of rusty red orange out of the tube, and so it can be, you know, kind of surprising, and people don't understand what the color is doing and why we make the choices that we do. So that's part of doing this chart too, is so that you can understand your pigment's behavior and make those choices very intentionally when you're choosing what colors to use for your model. And then you can also do that extra row of the cad red and yellow ochre to see how that behaves. Those are completely optional, but they do help as you move forward in the class with doing the portraits. All right, so do you have any questions? So your question was, how do I feel about quinacridone reds? You know, I've used them. I often bounce between a quinacridone red and an anthraquinone red. The differences are very subtle, and I often find that for my purposes, either one works because I know how to modify the color. Like, so let's say I'm with a quinacridone red and I want to cool it off and have it behave a little bit more like a cooler red, then I can add a little bit of blue to it. So you have some flexibility there. I usually list both of them, anthraquinone and quinacridone, as substitutes for alizarin crimson. Either one, they are different, but it's one of those things where you kind of develop a preference for one or the other, or you just make them work for your palette. So I would suggest maybe sticking to the anthraquinone. Now, and there's also like quinacridone rose, which is slightly different. You know, there's so many colors on the market. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. So I usually suggest just sticking to a relatively limited palette and just pick one. The main idea is that you have a warm red and a cool red on your palette. And I did list two other colors on the palette that were optional, and that was like a Naples yellow or a lead tin yellow. And I also mentioned like a phthalo turquoise. And so the concept behind a limited chart, so I'll just pull up yours here, is that we have a warm red and then a cool red. And we even have like more of an earth neutral red. And that's because most skin tones fall in that zone. And then we have more yellow dominant, but if you wanted to add additional yellows to your palette, maybe a warmer yellow would work, like a lead or a Naples yellow, which is a little more buttery than and a little more chromatic than a yellow ochre. And then, so you'd have a warm and a cool yellow, a warm and a cool red, and then a warm and a cool blue. And that's where that green turquoise blue comes into play. Now, you don't have to have that all the time, but that's kind of how I structure the palette, and that's how I'm thinking. So long as your cool red is cooler than your warm red, then that's the main thing. Especially when it's mixed with white, you want a pretty distinct difference between the two. All right, so last critique. Natalie, are you in here, Natalie? You're welcome. Yeah, and if you have any follow-up questions, just post in the forum. And if you make corrections to your guys' palettes and you want some feedback midweek, then go ahead and post that in the forum or email it to me. Either one is fine, and I will send you a response. Hi, Natalie. All right, so this is looking really nice. Yeah, good job. I can see a nice distinct difference between your CAD red light and your alizarin, and even the one in the middle. So this is kind of what I meant by bringing that middle one a little closer to cadmium. You can still see a distinct difference between the two, but when you start getting out here, you see how orange this looks, and this starts to take on a little bit more of a middle tone, and then here is definitely cool. That's exactly what we're looking for. It's just going to give you a little bit more choice, because when you're looking at your photographs or even your painting from life, you might see a model that falls right in here, and you don't have that color tubed straight out of the tube, so you have to know which mixture. And this isn't even the full kind of range that you can get between these two colors. We're just doing 3 steps. Well, actually 1 step between the two. So that, that alone gives you an idea of how much variety there could be. I mean, we could have easily made this a much more complicated color chart by doing, 3 steps in between each color transition. But that just becomes really, really extensive and a little overwhelming and kind of unnecessary. So, you can pretty much guess ballpark colors based on this limited color chart. All right, so yeah, this looks pretty good. Now you had sent me 2 pictures, one with the darker and one with the lighter, and I just kind of merged them. So over here you had your one that was exposed for the lights, and over here you had the one exposed for the darks, and I think I split it off right in here. So as you can see, it kind of reads pretty good. Other than this suddenly appearing kind of greenish, I think that's just a color temperature thing with the camera. But everything's looking really good. If you wanted to, you could go in and do that extra row with the alizarin with the yellow ochre and add that down below. So let me make this a little smaller. So you could do a row down here and essentially add that. And then you could do the row up here with the CAD red and yellow ochre, just so that you could see what it looks like. And then down here the alizarin and yellow ochre. And you can just get a feeling for how that combination works as well, because it is a kind of a common one for flesh tones as well. But I don't really have any further suggestions. Do you have any questions? Okay, that's a good question. So you said you've never used a glass palette and would like to get one. Any suggestions on brands or sizes? Okay, so I'm going to give you kind of a 2-part answer. When I'm painting in my personal practice, on my personal work, I actually use a large glass drafting table. So it depends on how much space you have and how much room you think you need. For me, the large glass palette is really great because I can have multiple palettes of color for different paintings that I have going all at once. Because I often come to the studio and I have 3 or 4 paintings I'm working on all at once, so I have plenty of room to mix that out. Glass is nice because it's really easy to scrape off. If your color's dry on there, it's no problem. If you're looking for something more portable, what I would suggest is getting a palette from New Wave. I'll write that down real quick so you can see what that is. You want to search New Wave palettes. I think I had had them in the supply list. I think I provided a link in that supply list. They have both the neutral gray glass palette, but they also have one that's wood that's also gray. So if you're looking for glass because it's flexible and you can kind of scrape off dried paint, then I would go with the glass gray palette. And I would get it in the larger size. I think the one I have from them is like 12 by 16. I wouldn't go much smaller than that. And they even sell them with, I don't know if you watched the video on how to save your paints week to week, but there was that kind of plastic container that was white and with the blue lid, and it's like air sealed. That is like a Masterson Stay Wet palette holder, and it's made for acrylic paint, but it actually works great for oils. And if you go to their website, they actually sell a glass combo with the Masterson plastic container, plastic bin. And that's actually a really nice combination, and it fits right in there. It's kind of made for it. And the nice thing about that is you can just pop the lid on at the end of the day and your colors will last a little longer. Or you can take it, if you're taking your palette with you a lot to like a class or a workshop, it's really portable, and you don't have to clean up your colors at the end of the day. You just pop your lid on and out the door you go. So that's what I used a lot as a student, was the New Wave glass palette inside the Masterson plastic bin. Lately, now in my demonstration, I had a few of you ask what kind of palette I was using, and I'm using their wood gray palette. And I'll post a link to that too in the forum today, just so everyone can kind of see the difference. The reason I'm using the wood one for our class is because of glare. So if you find that the lighting in your studio or wherever you're painting, the glass is creating glare and it's a little hard for you to see your colors, you want to get the wood one. It's satin finish. It's really, really nice to work on. It has a very smooth surface, very easy to clean. The downside to the wood palette is that you have to clean it at the end of every session. You can't leave paint on there to dry. So you have to scrape off your piles, put them on a separate palette if you're saving them, like a little piece of glass. I just use a picture frame, with the picture frame still around it. I just went and bought like a little cheap dollar store picture frame with glass. You can use plexi as well. And I put my colors on that if I'm using the wood one, because you don't want to leave that paint on there overnight. It will dry on there and it'll kind of ruin the palette. And you also can't use a paint scraper or like a razor blade on the wood to clean it. It tends to gouge, whereas the glass, you can use a paint scraper or a razor blade to clean it once the paint's dried. But yeah, I would recommend, and they make natural wood colored palettes too that are really beautiful, that are handheld, but I just use their tabletop one. Yeah, oh yeah, if you have a cat, trust me, they will, get their little paws in the paint, and pretty soon you'll see cadmium red trailing across your floor. So the Masterson plastic bin with the glass is a really great kind of combination. I would go with the larger size, just for practicality, and also you probably noticed when making this color chart how quickly you can run out of space on your palette. It happens just naturally. Even for me, 12 by 16 feels really small because I'm so used to my large drafting table glass palette. And if you're going to just use a straight piece of glass or make your own, make sure you paint the backside or put a piece of gray paper or something kind of neutral on the backside of the glass. Because you don't want to work against a white palette. It's really not ideal. It throws off our perception of values, especially when it comes down to the dark values. You start to, you won't, if you put this against white, in fact, I'll even do that here real quick. I'll change the background to a white background. It becomes much harder for us to see the temperature and the color in those darks. It really throws off our eyes. So if you're mixing against a white palette, it's the same concept. It completely throws your perception of the values and also of the temperature in those darker values becomes much harder for our eyes to see. All right, so now that we're done with the critiques, I'm going to just kind of open it up. If anyone has any questions at all, you can just type it in the chat box. It could be supplies related, it could be related to our past lecture, or anything that's coming up this week. And I know some of you kind of jumped in a little bit later, but we have quite a lot to watch this week. And don't forget, on the very last post in this week's lessons, there are the photo references to work from. And I know a few of you asked, can we work from our own? And I would suggest for these first 3 portrait studies, work with the references that I provide, because you're going to be mixing a lot of the colors based on what I'm doing. But in the last 2 weeks, everyone is welcome to work from their own photo reference. So just start to think about that. I will talk about that a little bit more next week. And if I don't bring it up, remind me, because I want to show you guys a little bit on what we'll be doing for our final project, which is a 2-week project. So Kaylee, you asked, on the note on palettes, you have a really large metal palette. Oh, that's interesting. So, but it's white. How can you make it into neutral gray without spray paint? Okay, that's a good question. Is it, okay, so your metal palette, is it like one of those butcher trays? Like it's like a tray. I have a couple of those, but I use them more for like acrylic and or is it like completely flat? One thing you might be able to do, if you can't use a spray paint, you could do like a roll-on paint. But what I would do is go down to like a hardware store and buy like an enamel-based paint that's not spray-on. You can get the kind that's like brush-on or roller. I would use like a foam, high-density foam roller. And you might just get black and white, a small little can of each. Sometimes you can buy just the small, I mean, they're really, really tiny cans for like paint samples. That would be enough for you, and make sure it's an enamel based, because that will help it stick to the metal, and then you can roll that on. So I would just go down to the hardware store and ask them which one would be good for sticking to metal. And what you might end up needing to do too is to slightly sand the surface, not real rough, but you want to scuff it just a little bit, then wipe it down with rubbing alcohol and let that evaporate off, and that'll get any kind of grease off of the surface, and then you can apply your enamel paint, and that should do it, and that should stick to it, and you can get a neutral gray with that. Susan, could you please put together a list and post in the form of the brands you like to use for each of your colors? Yes, that's a great idea. I'll put the exact ones that I'm using. I might have to post that in a couple of days because I won't be at my studio, and so I won't know exactly. I have a couple of different brands for different things. But yes, that's a great idea, and I will do that. Okay, and Sapana, let's see. General question, once you varnish, is there a way to go back and fix it? So once you apply the varnish is kind of like your protective layer on the painting. So no, the idea is that the varnish is kind of there to protect the surface of the painting. You don't want to paint back on top of another varnish. You would want to remove that varnish and then go back in and paint. Now, if you're wanting to bring back the color to go back in and paint, all you need to do is take a little bit of medium, oil painting medium, like you can use the Neomeglip, or you can use oleo gel, or you can use like even just straight linseed oil, and then you do what's called oiling out. I do go over that in my other class, and I think we'll go over it in the last 2 weeks of the class of how to oil out and paint back into a dry painting, because we'll be doing our 2-week project. So I will go over that a little bit later, but you don't want to apply a varnish and then go back in and paint on top of that. So I mean, but most varnishes can be removed with just Gamsol. So if you did apply a varnish already and you're wanting to go back into a painting, just look up how to remove that particular varnish. And Gamsol is a pretty mild solvent. It shouldn't hurt your painting if you remove it or use it to remove your varnish that you've applied. Oh, so it is a butcher tray. Yeah, I mean, that's fine too. So Kaylee, you can still use that enamel just use like they make those high density foam rollers that are made for painting cabinets. They're like extra smooth. That's what I use to prime my panels. And so if you use that, you shouldn't have, and then you like maybe lightly sand after, you should have a nice surface to work on. Because mixing against the white is really going to throw off your eyes. That can make a big difference. All right, does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to help. I will go ahead and post in the forum, though, about the glass palettes from New Wave. They're relatively affordable. I mean, they are made to last, and it's one of those things that you just kind of invest in, like your brushes, and if you take care of it, it will last you years and years. All right, guys, you are so welcome. All right, so you have a lot of video to watch this week. If you guys have questions in the middle of the week as you're starting to paint, you can email me or post in the forum. Sometimes I prefer if you do that, post in the forum, because oftentimes everyone has very similar questions. And if I can answer one person and then it helps others, that's always ideal. And let me think if there was anything else I wanted to mention. I think that was it. So check the forum a little bit later. After this, I will post a link to this video for those who might want to revisit it. Also, I will post the links that I was referring to throughout the critique today. I've been talking a lot today, so my words are fumbling a little bit. We had our morning critique as well. So, all right, guys, thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.